everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Tensura Reborn as the first Nephilim, Chapter 94 to 100, Chapter 88 Chapter by random note, see the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Lucian was back in his office now after naming Carrion and the Beastketeers. He thought back on the changes that came from that, and how they all now had gained greater power than before. This all became apparent in the following spars that took place between them, all that they insisted on to test their new capabilities. That combined with Lucian scanning them, and having Petra analyze the new data lead to him becoming aware of all their changes. This included the new skills they had gained in the process. Albiz had gained both a new unique skill, and an improved version of her existing one after being given a last name. Suppressor now possessed spatial manipulation that combined the subskills of spatial motion and spatial suppression. Lucian wouldn't be surprised to see it change to spatial domination soon, to be honest. The suppressor skill now also had spatial attach resistance as well added to it, allowing her to resist any space-related abilities that she doesn't counter in time. Her new unique skill, however, was also extremely useful for her, and her fighting style, Gorgon Eye. Gorgon Eye was evolved from Snake Eye, making it a unique skill focused around inflicting status ailments on others and ocular abilities. This skill lets her now extend her range of vision, inflict multiple status ailments on a single target instead of only one per target, and now pierce through tolerance skills at the resistance level. Those with nullification level skills were still beyond her capabilities of affecting, but now those with abnormal condition resistance and similar skills were no longer immune to her abilities, no matter how drastic the raw energy difference was. The ability that was the most interesting addition, though, was what could only be called far-seeing. This resulted in Albiz being able to throw her line of sight to somewhere else within a range of about 1 kilometer. Once she did so, Albiz could then see from that new position, as if she was there. It was essentially a highly advanced form of spatial scrying that let her collect information, and more importantly to her, get a bird's-eye view of any potential battlefield and troop formation. This fit with her role as it had been under Carrion, since the Beastmaster was not a particularly hands-on commander. This resulted in Carrion often simply searching out the strongest opponent, or the enemy commander, when fielding his troops for war, while leaving Albiz in charge of commanding others. Of course, there were also times when the army was fielded, and Carrion stayed back in the capital as well, where Albiz again was the one in charge of the field troops. In essence, Albiz was the general while Carrion was the king, and it worked for them. This ability would help in such endeavors, especially since Lucian hoped to make her in charge of such duties, as well involving the current lycanthrope forces. Carrion meanwhile would fulfill a different role going forward, mainly in the form of an advisor and high-ranking warrior. The Mun knows his people and can fight, but when it comes to bureaucracy and military strategy, Albiz is the far better option between the two, Lucian thought to himself with a small shake of his head. Next up was Sophia, though, the tiger woman, now possessing a new unique skill. This was her first ever unique skill, and it truly embodied her fighting style. It was known as Generator, a skill based entirely around lightning abilities and close-quarters combat. This included skills like electricity manipulation, a skill that let her build up electrical charge in her body, and for through motion and landing blows on her opponents, as well as the ability to discharge lightning into her opponent's body that broke through most standard defensive barriers. The buildup of electrical charge that her skill created enhanced her speed, reaction time, and her striking power in a way that was similar to how Alfred's gladiator worked to some degree. Overall, this resulted in Sophia becoming a blur of electric energy and lightning as a battle went on. She was ecstatic about the skill as well, enjoying the speed and new destructive potential she now possessed. It honestly reminded Lucian of a child on a sugar high after getting a new toy, and it made him smile. Next, though, was Phobio, who gained a bit of a surprising unique skill after naming. Phobio's new skill was called Terrorizer. The skill was based around the concept of taking in shockwaves and kinetic energy, often from others' attacks, and allowing him to do one of two things with it. The first was to store them and later release them in different ways, such as enhancing his physical attacks by releasing them into his opponent's body on contact, or even just releasing them through the air or ground for a ranged area effect attack. The second thing he could do with the stored energy was to use it as fuel for his signature black flames, essentially turning the kinetic energy into heat energy. The flames now also had a new property of inciting fear and panic in those he was fighting, often making them attack him blindly and without thought. In a way, the skill reminded Lucian of a soldier getting more fired up throughout a battle and dealing more damage as a result, with the flames' new abilities fitting for his new name. The inciting of fear and panic in his enemies befitting someone whose last name was the name of the god of terror and panic in Greek myth. Now Phobia was able to incite that panic and make use of it in his fighting, fitting for someone who wanted respect from others even if it came from them fearing his strength. Lucian hadn't forgotten how he tried to get the fledgling Tempest under Carrion in canon after all, especially since nothing the Mun had shown him made it seem out of character for the current him. That is a problem to deal with later though. There are plenty of people here who could put him in his place should it be necessary. Besides, once he stops being such a hot-head, and is given a serving of humble pie, he's a worthy ally from what I remember as well. A loyal one to and loyalty of someone strong is worth more than gold, Lucian thought to himself before going back to his reports. The three Beastketeers now also all had a few other skills. Things like magic aura, hockey, mana perception, danger detection, and strengthened body. They had also all gained some tolerance skills such as pain resistance, physical attack resistance, and flame attack resistance. Sophia and Albiz though also gained a special tolerance skill each as well. Sophia gained electric attack resistance, and Albiz gained abnormal condition resistance. He sighed though after seeing the lackluster information on it. The report he was currently looking at was one of the old census records from a few years ago, the last time a census was taken. Not only was it now likely woefully out of date, but it was also lacking much in the way of information. This all prompted Lucian to look up to see the last of those he'd named just a day prior, Carrion himself. Carrion had grown stronger as was to be expected, but he'd also gained a new unique skill. The skill's name was fitting for the Mun, called Beast Lord. This skill apparently took the previously unknown sub-skill of royal beast form called Leakin Mimicry, and made it into a whole new unique skill. Leakin Mimicry had allowed him to gain traits from other beasts that served him to add to his transformation from royal beast form. Now the new skill Beast Lord took this to a whole new level. The skill was akin to the food chain skill that Lucian remembered Rimuru having in canon. Now he can receive traits and power from beast-type creatures serving under him such as lycanthropes and their derivatives. The more faithfully they serve him the more power Carrion receives in turn. It fit the Mun known as the Beastmaster and former king of Eurysania for sure. The Mun had also had his intrinsic skill Bestialize be absorbed into royal beast form for better optimization, as well as had his self-regeneration become ultra-speed regeneration now. The Mun had also gained all the additional non-unique skills that his subordinates had gained, at least those he didn't have already. Strengthened body was also ignored in favor of his already existing steel strength, something that Lucian had no idea the Mun had had previously until then. But in addition to all this, Lucian had slipped something in as he named him, Ember of the Hearth. During his naming, the Nephilim had bestowed the Ember onto Carrion, mostly to see what effects could come about from giving the Ember at the same time as naming. Lucian hoped to see a greater effect in the long run, but that would take time to see the results of. Now though, he looked at the former demon lord with such a deadpan look of disappointment and exhaustion that it made even the normally unflappable Mun sheepish. The Mun looked more like a student that disappointed the teacher than a warrior of great prowess, and a veteran of an angel invasion then. Lucian would almost find it funny if not for his utter exasperation at the whole situation. What the hell is this supposed to be, Carrion? He asked redundantly while holding up a page of the census reports. The wince on Carrion's face spoke volumes, one that was shared by Albiz, who was also in the room with them. She'd been invited along due to her being more experienced in the paperwork that they had, while Carrion was here due to him being the one who had dictated what they even had reports on. Some may have thought that Lucian was being harsh here in his words and looks, but in truth he was being remarkably calm. After all, any bureaucrat worth their salt would have been far more apocalyptic in rage right now. The reason being that the census was composed of a single line of information for each settlement that was a part of the census. Number of trained men available in Fong Village, 23. That meant that the only thing they had been keeping track of from the population census was the amount of trained troops such as village guards or fighters of any kind. No tracking of laborers, traders, the age of its people, birth rates, or literally anything actually useful to Lucian right now. This was what made him so grumpy right now, and so exasperated with them. He hadn't realized this was the case till just recently after deciding to take a look at the records, having instead been focusing on their resources, and such while taking the rough population count he'd been told up till now at face value. He'd wanted to know things like perhaps what the standard profession was for the nation in order to take such things into account moving forward. However, Lucian found no such information available to him now, and far less than he could have ever expected. Everything was ballpark estimates and assumptions when it came to such things, and that was not going to cut it. It's the census survey. Albise responded after a while of dead silence, what should have been a statement coming out more as a question in her nervousness. Lucian let out a bone-weary sigh then that made him seem older than he really was. Carrion then spoke up after seeing his new lord put his head in his hands at Albise's words. "What's the problem, boss?" "All the important things are there," he asked, honestly seeming to not know what the problem was here. Lucian figured that would be his reaction, having been the man who set what was to be kept track of in the census. Seeing that Albise seemed to have a faint idea of what the problem was but not the specific reason, he decided to explain it to them. "The problem is that this includes nothing of importance for anything other than the military. And even that barely. There's no records of laborers and what kinds they are, the birth rates of our population, nor even things like the conditions of our citizens. Don't even get me started on the fact that we're lacking things like literacy rates and mathematical knowledge." He began to tell them all about the various things needed to be kept track of. He paused and took a breath, Lucian not wanting to get riled up too much and shout at them, despite the fact that he really wanted to write about them. After calming down, he started speaking once more. "All these things are needed in order for us to know and do very important things. This will let us know how much food and goods we may need to import going forward, how big our potential workforce could be for things like construction or clerical work, what areas are most important to station patrols at to protect the most people, and what areas we are most vulnerable to attack in both lack of personnel and supply chain wise. And the incredibly important thing of where the most trade takes place by getting records of foot traffic and average living conditions in different places to better inform our future trade both domestically and foreign," Lucian explained to them slowly, seeing looks of realization come to their faces with each word. What he didn't mention was it also would tell him about what areas needed improvement first in order for much of his plans to go through. Things like literacy rates would be important for setting up a more organized and efficient bureaucracy. The number of children and the birth rate would let him know how many schools would be needed for him to effectively implement education reforms and the like. The information on what professions were held and in what number would influence what products and innovations he could introduce and have be produced to increase trade the most easily as well. For instance, if there were a lot of carpenters, then introducing new building methods and various goods that could be made out of wood would be a good idea. Or if most of his population were farmers instead, if the possibility of introducing cash crops and more advanced farming techniques should be his priority alongside what Ivy was already doing. And should an industry have an overabundance of people in it, then Lucian could potentially see about relocating them into another industry, preferably one of the new ones he planned to introduce. These were all important things to consider and implement correctly in order to increase their economic power. "So what do we do then? How can we fix this and get you the information you need?" Albise spoke then while carrion looked like steam was coming from his overcooked brain. Lucian was glad to see her entering problem-solver mode now, and nodded her way at that. She puffed up a bit in pride, seemingly happy to have asked the right question. "What we do is put together a survey team to hold a more advanced census. These people will need to be trained while I put together the new census. They'll need to be literate, personable, and trained in how to talk to people in a calm manner that will result in the least amount of conflict so as to not accidentally insult the people they're getting information from. That's a good way to either miss things or get told faulty information." Once that's done, they'll then need to be trained in what the new census is asking and keeping track of, as well as how to get that information from the populace, he told her, taking into consideration everything Petra was telling him to include in the new project. Albies nodded at his word, seeming to take a piece of paper and a quill out of nowhere to note down what he was saying. It was moments like this that made Lucian understand why Benimru took her as his aide, and to be quite frank, how this nation hadn't fallen apart entirely from such inefficient administration. That seems doable, though it'll take at least a month to gather enough people and train them like that, she told him, seemingly coming up with an estimate using what she knew of the capital and their current staff. Lucian nodded, having expected as such to be the case. That's fine, besides, they are simply going to be the ones doing the first census. The first census will include only the bare essentials needed, while I'll be building a better and more elaborate one in the meantime. The more comprehensive one will take more training for our census takers to learn, and I also plan on cartographers to go with them on that second census to make a better, more detailed map of the nation as well. But for now, we need that bare-bones one done as soon as possible in order to proceed most effectively, the silver-haired man told her, getting a nod from Albies once more. He sighed then while running his hand through his hair once more. I guess maybe I can hire the orcs for some construction in the meantime, though, for some of my projects. Perhaps I can even offer them a permanent home here, what with their kingdom's decline recently, Lucian said, only to get a grimace in return from Carrion at the words. Lucian naturally asked what the problem was with what he said, only for Carrion to let him know something that made him quite frustrated. I'm sorry to say, but that's not possible. You can hire them for some construction work, yes, but you can't offer them a home or to move here. I made a deal with the other demon lords, mainly Clayman and Fry, that forbade it so that we all could make use of them. As my replacement both in my position as demon lord and ruler of Eurasania, they'll expect you to uphold the agreement as well. If you don't, you risk angering them and starting a feud with them, he told Lucian, looking a bit uncomfortable giving the news to him. Lucian in that moment had only one thing to say, one he didn't hold himself back from saying then. You've got to be fucking kidding me, man, he groaned out, cursing in his mind all the while that he now had this to deal with. It seemed Lucian just couldn't get a break when it came to his new leadership position, something he was becoming acutely aware of. Edited, June 8, 2026. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 95, Chapter 89. Chapter by random note, see the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Carrion saw how his new lord grew frustrated at the news of the agreement that he'd inherited. It made him feel a bit bad at the problem he had inadvertently caused his new lord. Perhaps that's what made the idea come to mind, considering it was normally not something he would consider given his more straightforward thought process. Well, there is a possible way to have some of them move here. Should they ask to live here themselves, without any prompting from you, then you can accept them no problem. It was actually a concession that Clayman advocated for. I think he initially planned on using it as some sort of loophole before abandoning the idea for whatever reason, the Beastmaster told Lucian then, trying to make the situation better. That seemed to make the man fall into deep thought then. Lucian had a hand on his chin, and his eyes seemed to lock onto nothing in particular. It was a stance that Carrion and the others had seen him adopt a few times since meeting him, often while he was in the midst of a large amount of paperwork. As such, this fledgling familiarity informed Carrion that he should remain silent for now and let his lord think. From the look Albies shared with him, it seemed she had come to the same conclusion as well. Eventually, though, Lucian snapped his fingers and spoke up, having finished his brainstorming. This could very well work in our favor if done right. If I had to guess, Clayman gave up on his endeavor to get them to stay in his territory due to how difficult it would be to make his nation actually seem like a better place to live in. His reputation as a demon lord, one known for throwing away his assets, should he no longer have a use for them at that, made it nigh impossible for the orcs to willingly ask anything of him. The fact that Clayman's territory is naturally gloomy and dark made it so that the prospect of living there was not a strong enough motive for them to risk asking him. So, in order to get them to live in our lands we need to make it inviting, and abusing my lack of reputation to get them to ask to live here. Lucian explained his conclusions and Carrion couldn't help but be a bit impressed. His new lord had accurately deduced where Clayman's possible plan went wrong, took that into account, and then found a way to take that information to make a viable plan that used his current circumstances to increase the odds of success. He'd also taken into account things like Clayman's reputation, the thoughts of the orcs, and his own current reputation to formulate his conclusion. It also seemed that Lucian had a plan in mind as well from the look on his face. So, in order to make the best of this situation, we need to hire a large number of orcs for a project. Preferably soon so they can be in the area when I give the speech to the assembled citizens of Eurasania in nearly 3 months' time. That will be the best opportunity to covertly recruit them, and get them to be more willing to ask to live here themselves. I even have just the project in mind to have them build. Lucian told them his thoughts, making Albiz and Carrion grow wide-eyed at the possibility being presented. Albiz was the first to respond then, her curiosity winning out in the end. "What would this construction be, my lord?" she asked, earnest curiosity in her voice at what their lord had planned. Lucian smiled then and put his elbows on the desk, hands folded as he leaned in. "How much do you think the citizens of Eurasania would enjoy a proper Colosseum right outside the capital?" he asked them then, a smirk on his face that told them both he already knew the answer. For it was clear to any that knew the lycanthropes what the answer to that question was. "I think it's safe to say that they'd enjoy that a hell of a lot indeed," Carrion said, a grin of his own on his face then at the idea. It seemed that Eurasania was going to have a new attraction soon enough, and Carrion for one was looking forward to it now. Blake sat on Arion's back and looked out at the assembled men below. Currently he was on an evening ride, and had decided to head up a nearby ridge to take a look at the force that now followed him. It made him reflect on all that was to come, and all that had happened to lead up to now. Shortly after the meeting that had been held in Lord Noctis's castle, preparations to depart had been made. The men were readied, the supplies packed and stored. Weapons poured out of smithies it seemed, smoke from their forges bellowing into the sky day and night. It had taken a few days to get everything in motion, and then they had headed out. Now they had been marching for 3 days and 2 nights, heading towards the predetermined battlefield Blake had decided on. Using the information gathered by Alex, they knew where the enemy was marching to, where they would travel, and thus where was best to intercept them. In particular, there was a specific place that was a large flat area that would serve them well in battle that was surrounded by trees. These trees would serve as good cover for a detached force should it prove necessary, while the plain would allow the enemy to see their main force just in time to be too late for their foes to retreat. Not if the commander wanted to keep his pride at least. This would work for the plan that Blake had devised, nearly forcing a parley between them as well due to the conduct of battle. Since it would appear that he wasn't intending a sneak attack, the manners of battle, as it was referred to, would be in effect. These were in actuality the rules of war that the Council of the West prescribed to. Malstance was still technically a part of the Council, and thus Blake's forces were owed the same courtesy as to have those rules be followed in any engagement with them. The fact that the enemy was sent on behalf of the Council made it all the more certain they'd follow the proper procedures, if for no other reasons than appearance's sake. One of these rules, though, was one Blake was going to use to his advantage. Chiefly, the obligation of parley. The rule was simple and one Blake had found to be quite useful potentially after reading the copy of the Rules of War that Noctis owned back in the castle. Rules of War was a book that detailed all the rules and agreed upon manners of war for the Council of the West, and one of them was that should the enemy wave the flag of parley before the battle, the other must honor it. And it is there I will be able to present my challenge. The parley will be honored, and the odds of the other lordlings and nobles accompanying the general is almost guaranteed. At least some of them will join in, if for no other reason than pure pride. And my challenge will play on their pride, and they'll do all the work in making the general accept it, Blake said to himself, feeling Arion Bray beneath him, and kicked the dirt. Sounds like you've got a solid plan there, lad, the steed said to his rider, the telepathic message coming across clearly to the redhead. Blake laughed a bit and petted Arion's mane gently before responding. Thank you for saying so, Arion, but I fear it will not go that simply. I fully expect that General Gaunt will not accept the challenge even with pressure from the nobles around him. I hope he will, but I believe it far more likely that he'll accept the challenge in words only and prepare a trap instead to kill me. That would be the smarter option, if the less honorable one. But this man strikes me as a realist from what I heard, a most dangerous enemy. Blake aired his worries to his steed, knowing that his companion would not betray the trust and vulnerability he had in that moment. Arion snorted at that and shared his own thoughts on the matter. It matters not what tricks he pulls nor how prepared he is, you must simply achieve victory regardless, Arion told him then, encouraging him in his own gruff way. From the warmth and faint feeling of approval from within him, Blake could tell that Yami and Hikari agreed with the alicorn's words. It made something within him relax a bit, like coiled stress easing just a tad. Still, Blake felt the weight on his shoulders as he looked out at the men, the weight of their lives that now rested on his decisions. Nearly 30,000 men waited for his orders, assembled to kill his enemies should he but say the word. All of them wanted to place a crown on his head and forge a throne for him to sit upon. It was far from what he ever envisioned for himself in his youth, but Blake regretted nothing that led him here. He would take the throne they offered him, accept the crown with humility, and lead them into a better age than the men of greed and contempt had for so long. Blake would strip the yoke of incompetence and slavery from this nation, protect it from those that would see its people broken down and underheel once more. And in order to do that he must see these enemies routed and pushed back. See General Gaunt, a lapdog of the Rossos, from what Alex was able to find, dead and gone. For never again would he allow them to take over this land and its people, not after they failed them so badly. Yes, I suppose you're right, Arion. It matters not in the end what scheme he has planned. All I need to do is rise above it and push forward with my strength. For if I cannot, then I never deserved a crown in the first place, Blake said with a tone of finality before turning Arion around and heading back to camp. Emma walked calmly as she was escorted out of the capital city of Dworgen and returned once more to her assembled people. 98 demons stood outside the borders of the Dwarven nation, waiting patiently for the return of their ancestor and master. It made a grin come to her face at the feeling of authority such a scene came with. But that smile grew wider at the idea of showcasing all her forces to her master in time, not just this sample before her. My lieutenant should be close to completing his assignment by now, I believe. Should I make a pit stop on the way back to the demon realm to pick up the rest? The primordial wight thought to herself with a finger on her chin in thought. In the end, though, she decided not to, instead wishing to get back to her lord's side as soon as possible. She had information to deliver, and it would be the height of rudeness to delay that information for any reason. Her forces can just stay put and wait in the demon realm for as long as needed. Emma's duties to her lord came first. We wish you safe travels, envoy of Demon Lord Lucian, one of the royal guards said to her, signifying that they had arrived. Emma also knew it was them politely saying get out. It almost made her giggle, the notion that they could order her to leave mixed with the poorly hidden sweat of anxiety the men had made for an amusing sight indeed. But she was here to forge connections for her lord and so refrained. It would not do to cause undue offense, especially this early in establishing ties to this nation of dwarves. Why, thank you, sir. I'm sure the trip back to my lord will be quite pleasant if swift, she told the men then, covering her face with her hand in a ladylike fashion to hide her smirk. The men seemed confused at that remark from her. Emma understood what must have been going through his mind. How could a trip of that distance, going to the complete other end of the continent, be swift? She was more than glad to show him. As such, shortly after her and her two aides met up with the others, she gave them all the command with thought communication. Then, in a massive flash of light, all the demons disappeared as if never there. For they all had been transported back to the nation of Eurysania, her lord's seat of power. The thought of the look on the poor man's face after seeing them all vanish made Emma finally let her laughter out. I bet that little man is oh so bewildered indeed. Let it never be said I don't leave an impression, whether coming or going, she laughed to herself, the assembled demons around her leaving her be then. They all knew by now to leave their progenitor to her devices when she got like this. It was better for their health and their sanity. Edited, June 12, 2026. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter by randomnote A/N. There is a new stat sheet released along with this chapter. Hope any that check it out enjoy it. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. Shizu sat in her quarters, sipping a cup of local tea, and sitting by her room's window. The view was great, showing all of the capital city from a height far above the earth. It was nice for her, a novelty to do nothing but sit back and people watch like a normal person. For so long her life had been nothing but rushing from one disaster to another, saving a town or a village and immediately heading out to find the next who needed help. Her life was movement and adventure, combat and facing things that go bump in the night. From demons to wild bears, from stray dragons to would-be demon lords, she slayed them all. Shizu was a champion of humanity, trained by one of the greatest heroes to ever live, in her humble opinion, and always striving to live up to those titles. Some called her a hero. Others a warrior for humanity. She saw herself as merely a woman, who knew nothing else in her life, and marched ever forward after forgetting how to stop. Now though, things had changed for her quite a lot. Now Shizu the conqueror of flames and champion of humanity, was resting in a demon lord's castle while sipping tea, and looking out on a bustling monster city. She was surrounded by monsters and Majin, by beings that could fell small nations alone, and she was doing nothing more than sitting back and finally resting for once. For the first time in her life she was happy where she was. She didn't feel that urge to move ever forward and search out her next fight. Her next tragedy in the making. She needed to stop. No, for once Shizu felt almost content. To make things all the more absurd, she was looking forward to seeing the very demon lord whose domain she was in later tonight. A flurry of butterflies filled her chest at the thought of seeing him again, of the dinner they were to share, just the two of them. She felt like the young woman she appeared to be rather than the nearly 80-year-old she was in truth. The looks from Alice and that Kushina woman made it clear that the others noticed her change in behavior as well, it seemed. The fact that Alice gave her a thumbs up once before leaving her, and Lucian alone, still made her blush scarlet. Yet, despite how different things were from merely even a year prior, she was more than happy with that. Though as she thought of Lucian, Alice and the others, a single thought came to her mind in curiosity. I wonder how Blake is doing, she asked herself before shrugging and going back to her tea. She was sure the young man was doing just fine. It took another week for Blake's forces to reach the chosen battlefield, good time to be sure, and faster than their enemies could have made it. Blake's method of storing supplies in his spatial storage showed its use once again by letting the army move faster than it had any right to. This was a crucial part of the plan, as their speed would allow them to surprise their foes without needing to worry about the enemy scouts spotting them somehow. Of course, the potential for scrying skills was possible, but they were exceedingly rare and seldom used for war. Thus the plan was going along smoothly by all accounts. Blake decided to make the rounds then, to walk among his men, and see how they were faring with his own eyes. For the most part it seemed they were calm and doing their various tasks with efficiency that was commendable, especially for what he knew to be a thrown-together force in truth. Many of the men here were in their first campaign, for some this would be their first battle. The training they had received was cut short in order to meet Gaunt and his forces, and Blake would be lying if that fact hadn't influenced his decision to try and end this with a one-on-one. For he knew that if a true pitched battle broke out, many of his men would die well before their time. He kept walking, thoughts of his men, and the battle to come filling his head. That was until he heard the notes of music coming from up ahead. It was warm and inviting, a jaunty tune played by resting soldiers around a campfire. Blake was drawn to it, and once the group playing came into view, a gentle smile came to his face. For amongst the playing band was Tristan, with what looked like a lute in his hands. The sight was one that brought a joy to Blake's heart, seeing the former slave enjoying something beyond what he had been allowed to do before while in chains. Tristan had spoken of this before to him during their travels. About how one day he'd stumbled upon the men playing some music and felt entranced. Eventually he'd mustered up the courage to ask if he could learn to play such things, such sounds that brought joy to others. The men had agreed, and Tristan soon found he had a talent for anything with strings. Notes came from the plucked strings in soft and beautiful melodies that made him seem far from an amateur. The former slave admitted that it felt nice to do something that didn't involve killing, to be more than the weapon his masters had forced him to be. When he spoke about how he used to view himself, a weapon meant to be used for the sake of others and nothing more, it made Blake feel all the more glad to have freed him. It made the young king's resolve firmer that this was the right path. That his crusade against slavery in all its forms was just and true. Perhaps, Blake thought to himself, it was what he was meant to do as a hero and king both. For now, though he simply enjoyed the nighttime entertainment as the men sung songs of boasting and legend, rowdy tunes and somber melodies alike in a true reflection of the breadth of the human soul. Maybe when this is all over, I'll make you the court musician, Tristan, Blake thought to himself with a chuckle, knowing the man was far too uncertain of his skills to accept right now. For despite him and everyone else thinking otherwise, Tristan said he felt unskilled. As he put it, something was missing for him to think himself skilled. As if there was something he needed in order to be his best that he hadn't found yet. Blake decided not to argue with him then, seeing the look in the man's eyes hold such conviction in that moment made him understand. The man was searching for something like how Blake sought the perfect sword, or Alice the perfect spell. It likely would never come, but the journey to try and make it or find it was part of what made life worth living. At least, for people like them it seemed. It was now the day they had been waiting for, the enemy was in sight. It would be only an hour or so before Gaunt saw their forces and the flag of parley they flew. Blake was currently in the command tent that had been set up when they first made camp 3 days ago. He looked out at the assembled men that made up his war council. Noctis sat to his left, Richard to his right with Shurzwa, and Bulat standing behind him in a show of power and loyalty. Next to Richard sat Tritan, and the rest of the commanders sat on Noctis's side of the table. Blake decided to get things underway, the last meeting before the battle came. All right, everyone here already knows the plan. James, I want you and your men to go east. Manson, you and yours go west. I want you both to circle back and hide in the forest awaiting the signal. I hope we can resolve this without needing to resort to the surprise pincer attack, but we can't rely on hope alone. Richard and Noctis will be coming with me to the parley. Bulat and Shurzwa will be here, and will rally the troops in the case of the enemy pulling anything and breaking parley, though that is highly unlikely to occur. Blake outlined the roles assigned to them all. Commanders James and Manson sat upright at being addressed, and gave sitting bows in recognition of their orders. Richard and Noctis nodded to their king at his words while Bulat and Shurzwa simply remained silent behind him. Blake then turned to Tristan and gave his last order before standing up. Tristan, I want you to take charge of the archers. Should the enemy come after us after the parley ends, I want the sky blacked out with arrows greeting them, he told the man he'd come to see as a friend. Tristan grimly nodded, knowing words on his part were useless right now and resolve and readiness was all that mattered. Blake then walked out of the tent and mounted Arion in a smooth motion. The others inside the tent stood up as well and rushed to fulfill their tasks with urgency. Noctis and Richard mounted their own horses next to him, and they trotted up to the front of the army then, watching the horizon for the enemy army. For a while the three men said nothing to one another, waiting in silence as the tide of war came for them once more. Richard was the one that broke it first. We've come a long way from fighting a hopeless battle against trolls, haven't we, my lord? He said to Blake with a faint humor to his voice. Blake turned to him then and smiled faintly at the man's words. True, this is a far greater battlefield. I just hope we can win this with even less casualties, he responded to the brown-haired man, resolute in his goal to prevent as much death as he can. Richard and Noctis shared a look at that. It was a look that spoke of 1,000 things. Joy, hope, fear and grim determination most of all. Joy at finally serving a man, a king, that cared for his men's lives and took no joy in sending men to their deaths. Hope for what such a man could accomplish once he finally took his rightful place on the throne at last, and had the power to change things on a nationwide scale. Fear for what would happen should he fall now, for what their home would become should they lose him. Finally, their determination to ensure that their king lived no matter what in order to see that hope-filled future come to pass. Even if it meant their lives. Blake meanwhile was unaware of the silent conversation the two men shared, too focused inward to notice. He spoke instead with the ones who shared space in his soul. "Are you sure it's wise to keep us hidden for now?" Hikari asked from within him, an almost motherly concern in her voice. Blake felt a warmth in his chest at her worry, but still stood firm in his decision. "Yes, we must give them the illusion that they can win. Showing you and Yami off would likely intimidate them too much to ever agree to a one-on-one duel. I must increase my chances of getting them to agree to such as much as possible, for everyone here," he thought back to her, unwavering in his choice here. He could almost feel both her and Yami sigh at his decision, but they seemed to leave it at that. Blake was grateful for their concern, but he knew this was how it needed to be. Such thoughts fled him though as his enhanced vision spotted movement on the horizon. He grabbed the reins of Arion, and turned to the two men by his side. "It begins," was all he said before riding out further ahead to prepare for their foe's arrival. The two men wasted no time and followed suit, not wishing to be left behind by their king. They shared one last look of grim certainty, and an unspoken oath was made between the two. The king must live, no matter what. General Gaunt rode at the front of the army, standing proud in full plate made by the best smiths in Silt Rosso. It was rare grade in quality, a gift from his Lord Granbell for long and exemplary service. He wore it with pride, and it made him feel unbeatable in truth, like a Goliath in armor among men wearing naught but cloth in comparison. As such he had no hesitation riding in front. Besides, any good commander should do so in his humble opinion. It inspired confidence in the troops, and it made certain Gaunt could get a good view of where they were heading. It was this good view that alerted him to the presence several leagues ahead. Somehow, someway an army sat in the distance flying the flag of Parley high. The sight baffled him, and took him completely off guard. The scouts reported nothing of such a force moving here, the general said to himself in astonishment. He quickly pieced together that they had somehow evaded his scouts. In Gaunt's mind that meant one thing. These troops knew the terrain better than them by a wide margin. That meant these were local troops, perhaps even the force they heard tell lead by a rebel calling himself king. Now they flew the flag of Parley, as if mocking them in how they must adhere to the rules of war the Honorable Council has set. It made him grind his teeth in frustration as he motioned for a full stop of the army. Soon after the stop was made, several men came riding up. They were mostly the nobles that had come along, as well as a few commanders and the leader of a mercenary band that had been hired for this campaign. Why had they stopped? Thankfully he need not tell them all himself, as the view of the waiting army flying that flag told them all exactly why. Once the leaders of the group had all made it to where Gaunt still remained on his horse, they all looked out in silence for a while. "What should we do now?" someone among them asked with a staggered voice. Gaunt wasn't sure who broke the quiet, nor did he care. "We meet them for parley, of course. That is the rules we all abide by, and like it or not, Malstance is still a part of the council. Besides, I want to get a good look at this would-be king with my own eyes," General Gaunt said, his voice like a steel drum struck by an angry god. The others did the only thing that made sense, they nodded and obeyed. None of them wished to disagree with the dog of the Rossos after all. Not when he was like this. Chapter 97, Chapter 91. Chapter by random note. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Lucian sat in his office, hands steepled with elbows atop his desk in the way that had quickly become his thinking pose as of late. What he was thinking of though required focus, and it seemed the room's sole other occupant understood that. Emma had a sixth sense for those kinds of things, it seemed. Perhaps due to her understanding of politics, or maybe even just age bringing its own unique form of wisdom. It didn't matter though. All that did was that she was silent, and let him go through his thoughts at his own pace without interruption. The subject of his thoughts did include Emma though, in particular, what she had told him a few days ago after coming back from Dworgen. Chiefly how King Gazel wished to meet in person soon. Lucian understood that this was his best opportunity to get several plans going in the direction he wished them to. The ability to meet with the Dwarven King represented the ability to set up trade agreements, covert alliances, and just in general granting his rule more legitimacy in the eyes of the rest of the world. That would be useful for what was soon to come, considering what Alex had reported on about Blake. Blake was soon to begin the battle with the forces sent by the Council of the West. A battle that he would win one way or another. In Lucian's mind, his brother's victory was something just waiting to happen rather than a possibility. It was fact to him. That was due to more than just brotherly confidence though. The reports from Alex made it clear that there seemed to be no real threats to Blake all told. Lucian believed in fact that his brother could potentially decimate the enemy by himself if he went all out. A tornado of swords that can cut through armor like butter was something the redhead was capable of after all. What came after was what Lucian was thinking about more than the battle itself. The plan they all had come up with was simple in all honesty. Blake would win this battle and then head to the capital as soon as possible afterwards. They'd coast on the momentum of that victory to quickly declare him king of Malstans, before any of the petty nobles could get themselves together. Once that was done, it would mostly be cleaned up from there. Blake holding the capital and sitting on the actual throne would be a massive symbolic victory that would serve to give him legitimacy. The rest of the nobles would then either fall under their banner, be negotiated with to get them into the fold, or be taken out with sheer force if needed. All the while Blake would be able to rule and station his forces in the most well-provisioned and easily defensible place in the nation. Suffice to say, getting Blake to the capital nearly ensured victory. Not only would he be in the most valuable position in the nation defensively, but he could make use of the industrial part of the capital to better outfit his men. This would let him secure his power and rule even more, and let him exercise his right as king. In particular, allowing him to then make decrees as the official king. Decrees like separating Malstans from the Council of the West. That would be the final nail in the head, and truly show that Malstans was under new rulership. It would also allow them to get out from under the control of the Rossos, the taxes that needed to be paid to them that a recovering country would struggle to pay, and not need to worry about conforming to the laws of the Council of the West. The main law that they wished to be free of was all the discrimination laws against monsters that made any form of cooperation between a monster nation and a human nation so difficult. However, Lucian and Blake both knew there were risks to this course of action. Thus Lucian would then immediately after Blake took the nation out of the council release a public decree that he as the ruler of Eurasania recognized Blake as the proper ruler of Malstans, and the separation as legitimate. That wasn't all, however. Lucian actually had something else in mind to aid his brother, negotiating with King Gazel to do the same and recognize Blake's rule as well. That would likely be a hard sell for sure, but Lucian was prepared to make concessions to achieve that goal. Besides, it would benefit Gazel and Dworgen as well for sure. How this would benefit the Dwarven nation was actually quite simple as well. They needed trade partners that would treat them fairly. The near stranglehold that Falmouth had on their imports was well known. If Lucian offered to trade food to Dworgen, then that could decrease the reliance on Falmouth. This would certainly make them enemies of the greedy nation, but them invading was geographically disadvantageous in the extreme. In order to attack Eurasania, they would need to march through the forest of Jura, and in order to attack Malstans, they'd need to march through several nations that are part of the council. The fact that by attacking Malstans they'd also be declaring war on Eurasania would also dissuade them from that course of action. Honestly, if Falmouth tried to attack either nation due to them trading with the independent power of Dworgen, a world war would be likely to break out. The men in charge of the council were not idiots and would see this. They would also see that they could not afford a war like that with the Empire always waiting to pounce. Granbell especially would not want that and see the conflict for what it was, serving the West up on a platter for the Empire more than anything. So, with all this said, there was still the problem of how Eurasania would be able to get their goods to Dworgen. Lucian had a few plans in mind for that, including a few magical solutions that he gave Alice as projects to work on. But the most straightforward was to use Malstance as a midway point. Both Eurazania and Dworgen could send goods to Malstance more easily than to each other directly, not having to go through the forest at all. Instead they could travel along its edge, the least dangerous part of the forest, as Lucian and the others had done while traveling. There would still be risk, but that is also where Blake's nation could step in with an industry and service of their own. With them succeeding from the council, that would mean losing the support of the Free Guild. That would mean that the local adventurers would be out of work. But that would not last for long, as they intended to have them work as escorts for traders instead. They, combined with the likely large number of military forces that would be sitting idle after the internal conflict was done, would form a new organization that would have duties including, but not limited to, protecting trading caravans through their routes. All this was made even better for Lucian and Eurazania due to the fact that they had an in with another faction that would prove useful for all this. The Tengu clan, to be specific. Eurazania could make an alliance with the Tengu, something that was already in the works, and just needed to be finalized by Lucian meeting up with Keed. With that alliance in place, not only could they include the Tengu village into the network of trade, but Eurazania could far more easily pass through their territory to get to Malstance to fulfill their side of trading. The potential for Tengu joining the forces of Malstance in protecting traders was also something to consider. All this trade, these alliances and plans, rested on Blake winning his battle. For only then could Lucian begin to act and meet with Gazel from a place where he could make such promises. Emma knew this, and that was why she was staying silent. For there was the small complication that they'd needed to wait until Blake won before meeting, and had thus needed to postpone the meeting with Gazel. I made a mistake sending Emma too early. If I had waited a bit longer, I would not need to have worried at giving insult, though in a way I was saved by Gazel being the one to request a meeting. If Emma had made the request on my behalf, and we needed to delay, I'd be in a lot of trouble, and need to make more concessions to recover from giving insult, the silver-haired man thought to himself with a sigh. In essence, Lucian saw things were moving fast, and was feeling overwhelmed to a certain extent. This had resulted in him moving too fast in order to keep up. Yes, Shizu was the one to encourage him to reach out sooner, and there were definitely other factors that made reaching out sooner the right decision. But the fault was his in not telling Emma to give a definitive date that could work for their purposes. That was what led to his situation right now. It was also why Emma was here, having just gotten back from delivering the message that they needed to delay with Dworgen. So he finally addressed her after going through his thoughts. How did they take it? What's the damage? Emma stood straight-backed and proud before answering her lord's question. They took it well, my lord, all things considered. They accepted the delay but said that they expect the meeting to take place within 30 days and no later. I confirmed and came back to report, she told him with a small smile on her face due to how well it went. Lucian breathed a sigh of relief, glad to hear that news. 30 days was more than doable, and was a fine concession. Still, he made a note to add something extra to the gifts being prepared for the meeting to make up for this. He would not be seen on the back foot politically as much as he could help it. With that out of the way though, Lucian couldn't help but wonder how Blake was doing. He shook it off though, knowing that either Alex or Blake himself would let him know if something was wrong. Instead he turned back to Emma. Well, with that out of the way, I think it's time I brought up how the vessels for your subordinates are coming along. Blake trotted along on Arion with Noctis and Richard right behind him. Soon enough they made it to the middle ground between the two forces and waited for the other side to come and meet them. Thankfully it didn't take too long, only 20 minutes or so for them to make the decision on who all was going and to then get there. That was honestly a tad bit faster than the young king had thought it would take them with so many large egos in the mix from what Alex had told him. Regardless, General Gaunt led the group as expected and soon after they stood before one another while mounted on their respective steeds. You stand before General Gaunt, leader of the United Forces of the Western Nations. State your name and purpose for this parley at once. One of the other men from the general's side shouted, the introduction customary for them. Blake however sat up straight from his position atop Arion and introduced himself, needing no one to make introductions for him. I am Blake, the appointed king of Malstance as decreed by the people. I have called this parley in order to resolve this peacefully, and ask you to leave these lands immediately. This is an internal matter that you are intruding upon. Blake declared his name and intentions with confidence, and a glare in his eyes that spoke to his resolve. The men on the other side of the field looked from one another for a moment before bursting out laughing. For a while the enemy laughed and laughed at the demands of who they saw as a nobody. That was until General Gaunt raised his hand to halt their laughter so he could speak. That is not going to happen, boy. My men and I are under orders to bring stability back to Malstance, a member nation of the Western Council, by order of the heads of the Council. We shall not let an upstart like you do as you please, and we certainly will not let a child playing at wearing a crown order us to leave, the gruff voice of the general said, filled with the arrogance of a man thinking he was talking to a foolish child rather than a proper foe. Blake tightened his grip on Arion's reins, frustration bleeding through before he calmed himself. He knew this was likely how things would go, and he wanted them to underestimate him anyway. It still was annoying, but when next he spoke the redhead made sure none of it colored his voice. Then how about a compromise then, good sir? A one-on-one duel, me against any champion you have. The loser backs down and does as the other commands. In that case, should you win, I will back down, and let you do as you've been ordered with no further trouble. Should I win, you turn around and leave Malstance for good. What say you, General Gaunt? Blake issued the challenge to the shock of the general and his men. For a while all that could be heard on that side of the field was the whispers of the assembled audience of nobles. They spoke on Blake's arrogance, of how the general would beat him in no time. Of how they'd be foolish not to accept the foolish false king's offer. This all, in combination with the man's pride, made the general's answer clear and inevitable. Very well, in 2 hours' time, we shall meet her once more, and I shall remove your head from your shoulders. For if we do this it is to the death, and I will accept no other way, he shouted out, likely thinking the risk of death may make Blake back down. Blake instead looked at him with resolve and turned away. Noctis and Richard followed their king as they went back to camp. Blake then turned his head and shouted one last thing at the men before they became too far away. Then I wish you luck and recommend you savor your last 2 hours on this earth. For I shall meet you in battle and prove to all that you are now a dead man walking. Chapter 98, Chapter 92. Chapter by random note, see the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. General Gaunt made it back to his men, the lordlings following him, as they talked amongst themselves in voices that were far from the whisper they intended. The comments about upstarts and prideful commoners were things he mostly agreed with, but still the gossiping was unbecoming, he felt. Regardless, Gaunt was glad to see that the men had set up the command tent like he'd ordered before leaving. There he could hold a proper meeting, and address the various leaders all at once. It certainly was better than trying to speak to them all while mounted. So once he got within ample walking distance, the general dismounted his trusty steed. With naught but a nod at some of his trusted men, he walked into the tent, the message clear to all what was intended now. Sure enough, the others soon filed in, and the makeshift war council came together. For a while none of them spoke, as if unsure who should speak first, since he remained quiet for now. Soon though one of the lords from some small nation Gaunt didn't remember the name of spoke up. We can't honestly be thinking of abiding by this farce, can we? Why should we honor a duel with some jumped-up commoner? The pompous-sounding and looking noble asked the quiet room with an air of importance and disdain. A scattering of those assembled nodded along faintly, somewhat agreeing with the sentiment. But the vast majority looked affronted at the words instead. Are saying that we should besmirch our honor for this cur? That we should abandon the laws we all follow because of this? That sounds like you think we would lose. Another of the young nobles said, sounding incensed at what was implied. Thus proceeded a cascade of other nobles shouting things to the same effect. None of them believed that the men they saw was anything special. Nor did they think there was anything to worry about in the event the duel took place. Many knew the reputation of General Gaunt. he may be the dog of the Rossos, but he was an attack dog. He had been chosen to lead this group for a reason, and that had been his skill in all things martial both personally and strategically. None doubted him, and so seeing that the opinion here was set, the man himself spoke up. "We have agreed to a duel, so it shall be done. Besides, there is no way I shall lose to that young upstart. This will let us also save our troops' strength, should any of the locals give us issue in re-establishing order." The general said to them all, his voice not raised but commanding respect, and all to listen nonetheless. Some of the ones that the initial noble riled up looked a bit sullen at that decision but ultimately accepted it. The rest simply had looks like this had been the only possible choice, and their views were validated. Shortly after they all left, some grumbled while others boasted to their peers. The whole affair made him sick, tired of their games and squabbling after traveling with them all for so long. Guint sighed out before calling in his own men, only his most trusted aide having remained in the room before then. When the group of people he'd personally chosen and trained over the years came into the tent, he felt himself ease a bit. Speaking to them was far easier than the nobles and the like. With them he need not worry about their egos getting in the way overly much. That was worth more than gold to him in moments like this. "As I'm sure you've heard by now, the enemy commander has challenged me to a duel. Supposedly in order to avoid undue bloodshed. I have accepted and shall trounce him in the coming hours. However..." General Guint paused before looking them all in the eye. Each of them tensed up, knowing that their general was about to give an order he would not let them fail. "I have not gotten this far by foolishly relying on the most obvious outcome coming to be. As such, I order you all to prepare the blood shadows Lord Granbell has lent us. In the event that I fail to triumph in this upcoming duel, they are to kill the enemy commander and decimate the enemy force. That is all." He gave the command and following dismissal in a cold voice devoid of mercy or hesitance. The assembled men broke out in a cold sweat at the order before leaving. They knew what those things were. Emotionless husks made into weapons that killed without mercy. Soldiers in the loosest sense of the term, and more akin to weapons that moved on their own. The fact that they followed all orders without flinching, no matter how severe, only added to the intimidation. Of course, none of them knew the truth, not even Gaunt. The truth being that these weren't men and women trained to absolute loyalty, but instead poor souls chained by magic to become nothing more than a tool. In the end the result was the same though. Should the order be given, the blood shadows would live up to their name and blood would be spilled. They all hoped it wouldn't come to that. The general though had a feeling in his chest though that such hopes may be in vain. He hoped he was wrong, but he wasn't exactly known for being wrong about these things sadly. "Please, let this boy be nothing more than a braggart. For if not, then I fear death shall visit the field this day," the man said before rising from his chair to prepare. He had a duel to get ready for after all. Blake stood in the center of the chosen battlefield, waiting for his foe to appear. Behind him was Noctis and Richard once more, as well as a small group of men. They would be the witnesses to the coming bout, for good or ill. Blake had not taken long to prepare though, only going back to camp to inform the others that the enemy had indeed accepted, and then gathering the men for witness. He'd then returned to the chosen field and waited since, wanting this done and over with soon. For, to be frank, the redhead grew tired of the warring, and wished the fighting to end. Eventually the enemy force came to meet them led by General Gaunt. The man dismounted from his horse in a fluid motion before coming to stand before him once more. They were close in height, though the difference in build could be seen by all. The general was more stocky, built like a boulder wrapped in iron more than a man. Blake meanwhile was leaner, more proportional and regal-looking in many ways. The difference between a hero and a brute was how he'd later hear Richard describe it. "Are you prepared to fight, regardless of the outcome, little king?" the older man mocked while asking his question. Blake didn't flinch at the words and only nodded before stepping back. He made room and motioned for his men to do the same, the dueling circle forming around them in moments. It was only once General Gaunt entered the ring that he responded verbally. "I am, though I shall not fall here." My will and my people ensure that I cannot. Blake told him, voice filled with the weight of the duty he'd chosen. It seemed that comment had impressed the large man somewhat, as he responded with only an acknowledging nod. They then both drew steel and took their stances in preparation for the battle to begin. A man from the general's side came to stand between them before taking a few steps back. He raised his hand and Blake began his analysis of his foe. He is using a great sword, two-handed with a firm grip. That combined with his heavy armor shows he's a power-based fighter that relies on heavy blows and tanking lesser ones. Brutal, efficient and slow. He thought to himself as he took everything in, knowing his opponent was doing the same thing. Blake had chosen a bastard sword for this fight, and came to further believe that to have been the right choice. The ability to switch between two-handed and one-handed grip would allow for him to switch between strong defense and fast offense with ease. Perfect for taking blows from the heavier style his foe seemed to use, and then using his speed to counter. That all passed through Blake's mind in almost a blink before the man from the general's forces dropped his hand and signaled the match to begin. Gaunt wasted no time, launching himself at Blake with some impressive speed for his size. Just as Blake had anticipated, though, he started off with a heavy overhead swing of his large blade. The redhead caught it on the flat of his own blade and braced, taking the force of the swing well. Seeing this, Gaunt disengaged and began to hammer Blake's defense with swing after swing. To those looking on, it looked like Gaunt was beating him down, breaking Blake's defenses and making him give ground. In truth, though, the young king was far from being in a bad spot. Instead, Blake was looking at the pattern of the men he was fighting. For he had a plan, one that would hopefully help ensure his victory went unquestioned. Time passed, though, Blake dodging, deflecting or blocking the heavy blows from the general. Eventually, though, after about 5 minutes of sustained combat, the men began to flag and tire. That was what Blake was waiting for, knowing it was coming eventually, for his opponent was still just a man. A human that had not even become an enlightened could not compete with Blake's stamina. The fact that General Gaunt was older and chose such a physically taxing style made it all the more certain. So, using the tiring of his foe, Blake made an opening with his latest deflection before striking. In a smooth and practiced maneuver, General Gaunt was disarmed, blade sent flying into the dirt. Before the man could process this, though, he found steel at his neck, Blake's blade finding the smallest of gaps in his armor that let his blade be posed to take the man's head. Sweat beaded down his face at realizing his position, but still he spoke. "Go on then. End this and take your prize, boy," he shouted out, panting for breath and from the weight of his anger at his defeat. Blake stared at him coldly for a moment then before speaking. "Admit defeat and return to whence you came, never to step foot in my lands again," he told him, voice hard like steel in its command. Gaunt shook his head and refused, growing more angry at the situation. "I shall never yield to the likes of you. And I'd rather die than return in disgrace." He rebuffed the attempt at mercy, causing Blake to sigh. Seeing there was no changing the man's mind, Blake swung his blade. The steel cut through the man's neck in one clean swing, and his head fell to the ground separate from his body. Yet, Blake saw something odd once he'd done so. For upon the general's face was a malicious grin filled with malice. Why would he be smiling as such before his death? The young king thought to himself before soon getting his answer. For within moments of the man's head falling from his shoulders, Blake found himself surrounded by people in robes that hide their face. Each radiated power far greater than the general, yet held a coldness that made Blake think of the dead. There were 9 of them he could see at that moment, and he wasn't given much time to think before they attacked him all at once. A flurry of attacks came his way, and Blake heard Richard and Noctis scream his name. They needn't have worried though, for now Blake was angry. And he was terrible at holding back when he got angry. What followed was a burst of power that blew everyone on the field back from its intensity. Once the winds the force kicked up died down, though the form of Blake was revealed for all to see. In each hand was a blade of great power, at least unique grade both of them. From his back grew a black and white pair of wings, Yami and Hikari fusing with him in that moment for more power. And taking the form of a spectral blue lion pelt was Leo, lending his power to the king as well. Then, the king let out a shout that was more akin to a roar that made many fall to their knees from the force and terror. "Fine then, you honorless bastards. If you shall not honor our agreement, then I shall force you to, and show you just how merciful I was being. So come forth and let the blood begin to spill, for there is no turning back now." Blake yelled out, the beast-like instincts from Leo shining through now as a savage grin lit up his face. It was then that the forces from the council knew one thing. They had poked the bear, or lion in this case. And he wasn't happy to say the least. Chapter 99, Chapter 93 Chapter by random note, see the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Bullet looked on from his place at the front of the held-back army. He understood what his role was here, essentially keeping the men both ready and at bay in case the worst should happen. He needed them prepared to attack should the enemy attack them and break the agreement of the duel. To be honest, the veteran soldier believed it was likely that even with his king winning, the enemy would charge them regardless. Luckily his king wasn't a fool that believed in honor to the point of ignoring preparation. The pincer maneuver he'd had planned and ready was proof of that. Still, Bullet felt something was wrong as he watched on from several dozen yards away at the duel taking place. His arrival in this world has heightened his pre-existing senses somewhat, and allowed him to see the battle from even this distance. Lord Lucian had said it was likely due to the magicules he was exposed to when coming to this land that made it possible. The fact that Bullet was more than a normal human also played a part apparently. When he'd been told that he was abnormal, and that likely all the humans in his world were to some extent, he'd been confused. That had been cleared up though by the stories that the one beside him told of his own home world. Shirzwa was standing beside him, ready for battle while dressed in leather armor. It was more flexible than steel plate, but offered less protection in exchange. Shirzwa didn't particularly care about that though, he just wanted to move freely, and not be slowed down by the bulky plate in any way. It suited his more mobile fighting style he'd developed while training with Alfred what felt like oh so long ago. Regardless, it was tales of Shirzwa's home world that informed Bullet just how abnormal the humans in his own world had been in comparison. The blonde had told him how he was considered a freak, and a monster in many ways due to his strength. When he spoke of the feats of strength though, Bullet soon became confused. Apparently Shirzwa could with some great effort to lift something called a car. It weighed about 1.5 tons on average, something that Bullet thought shouldn't be that impressive a feat. He knew some soldiers, elite ones albeit, that tackled and fought beasts weighing over 10 times that amount. Fighting danger beasts of great strength was not uncommon, often by those without any imperial arms. Hell, Tatsumi had once told him how he fought and killed an earth dragon by himself with relative ease. And he was just some random kid from the middle of nowhere with next to no formal training. Yet apparently for most regular humans even in this world that would have been a feat of great power. That same earth dragon that his little bro had slain would likely be a C-rank monster here, something that was quite dangerous but manageable for those of this world by adventures. Yet the humans in Shirzwa's and even Lucian's worlds would have died next to immediately even if they were the strongest in the world. That truly highlighted the difference to Bullet then. As he once said to Shirzwa, in his world he was a freak of nature, but in Bullet's he'd be nothing more than a promising warrior. Right now though none of that mattered as it seemed the duel was coming to a close. King Blake had his sword to the enemy commander's throat, though he seemed to be offering him mercy. Soon though it became apparent that his foe would not take the offer, and the red-headed king cut through the soft neck of his foe in one clean swipe in response. Bullet couldn't stop himself from nodding in pride. His new king did it clean, and didn't drag it out. Such was a mercy, for he knew of executions far more gruesome and painful that rulers past could have used for such a situation. One could tell a lot about a ruler by how they treated their defeated foes, he felt. It was however a short-lived victory, as nearly immediately after the enemy commanders had hit the dirt 9 figures in dark robes appeared. They all registered as strong to his senses, not as strong as the king individually but together they posed a threat. Rage filled Bullet then, not having expected the enemy to pull such a deplorable tactic. He may be a former assassin, but even he had respect for the art of war. These people it seemed had no such respect, and would rather go against their word in the extreme than have honor in defeat. The fact that Bulat saw the enemy army begin to move made it all the more clear that this plan reeked of dishonor. But he would not let his new king be swarmed, not let the first ruler that he saw deserve the title be drowned in steel. So, with a heavy heart that felt the weight of all those that would die with the words he was about to speak, the Dragon Knight gave the order. To battle, men! Let us rout these bastards and prove to all that this nation shall be free of their masters forevermore. The preceding charge sounded like the beating of a war god's drum. All-consuming, all-powerful, and full of the righteous fury of a people that refused to be chained ever again. Blake looked out at the 9 foes that surrounded him then, assessing them all while keeping his desire to pounce on them down so as to not be caught by some strange ability. That hesitance soon proved both detrimental and advantageous, as one of his foes took advantage of the pause. One in the back set up some sort of spatial barrier that separated them all from the rest of the battlefield. It seemed that they wished to cut off any reinforcements that could help him. Blake, however, was glad. It meant none of his men would be able to intervene, and cause him to hold back for fear of them dying in his wake. One of the hooded figures then launched themselves at him, a shiny metal blade coming for his throat with speed. Blake blocked the strike with one blade and moved to attack them with the blade in his other hand. However, before he could, they were suddenly moving in reverse back to their original position. For a moment Blake's mind stuttered at what he thought was time manipulation, but soon calmed back down. His own connection to space, enhanced with Leo fused with him, allowed him to sense that it was actually a spatial ability as well. At least, it was in part. Deeper analysis had to wait though, as he suddenly heard chanting to his left coming from another of his foes. The man that was chanting was in the back alongside the one who set up the barrier, seemingly the two making up the back line along with one other. The chant ended quickly though, and a giant ball of fire was launched at him. Blake smirked and launched a slash at the fireball, enhanced with the space element that separated and broke the fireball apart before it went on to attack the caster. Sadly though, another hooded figure flashed in front of the caster, and moved to block the slash. It was once the attack was close to this new figure that something happened that made Blake look unstunned. A magical shield came forth as the figure lifted up a normal circle shield. It was magnificent, stylized like something from a tale that Lucian would tell him. It then blocked and dissipated his slash as if it were nothing, like a small wave splashing along the rocks. It was only the involuntary sound of strain the shield's user made that showed that it was not as easy a feat as it appeared to be. That, however, would be the last moment of respite Blake had before he was hammered by his foes. The first that had some sort of rewind power kept kiting him, coming in for a slash before retreating immediately. Another that hadn't been attacking yet would come in after that and take his attention, fists flying at him in a flurry of blows that had a faint haze of heat around them. Whenever he was close to landing a blow on either, the shielder would intervene and block or divert his attacks. Then there were the ranged attacks coming from the rest. The mage from before seemed to never stop chanting, launching spell after spell his way whenever possible. Another had a bow that seemed to shoot energy arrows that Blake wasn't sure if it was the result of a skill or some special property of the bow itself. Then there were 2 others that seemed to be some sort of debuff specialists. One was a woman singing, the sound ringing in his ears and making him stumble at the worst times. He tried to resist the effects, but it seemed that the singing wasn't purely magical, instead somehow using a frequency that made him dizzy and impaired his coordination. The last figure stood back with the singer, with knives ready dipped in something that he had a feeling was bad for anything living. Individually they all were fairly weak, none stronger than Bulat if he was honest. But they worked together in some sort of supernaturally effective teamwork. It went beyond just coordinating with thought communication. It was as if they had been trained to work together in order to take down strong foes for years. It spoke of either great strength or training so intense it could have been called torture. But Blake couldn't focus on that though, as he kept fending them off. It wasn't until though that he got a strike in that cut through the Rewinder's armor that he saw something that showed him how long this was going to take. The Rewinder backed off after the damage his armor took, and went up to the last member of their group that hadn't done anything yet. They laid their hands on the broken armor, and it repaired itself right before his eyes. It was like seeing a wound heal from a potion, the steel knitting itself back together in moments. Once it was down, the rewinder went right back into the fray, and attacked him once more. They keep hounding me, like wolves fighting a bear. This isn't good, I can barely think right now trying to keep track of them all. Blake thought to himself as he blocked another blow only to be hit in the back by a spell. If something doesn't change soon, they may just get a lucky hit in. This was Blake's conclusion, but he had no idea what to do in order to resolve this. That was when he heard a voice in his head speak up, and he nearly sagged in relief. "We have some information for you, Blake, information that will let you end this," Yami spoke from within him, voice serious, and Blake took a hold of it like a lifeline. "What is it, Yami?" Anything right now would really help, he thought back to the darkness elemental as he blocked another blow from the one with burning hands. "It seems that they are being controlled somehow, like they are being forced to act like this. After reviewing the data your analysis skill is collecting, we think they are under the effects of some sort of slave seal. It feels like a stronger version of what that poor boy Tristan had," Hikari told him, making Blake growl in rage. The two elementals were able to put this together only due to their current fused state. This allowed them to share senses with Blake. This included all the information he was gathering, but couldn't pay attention to right now due to being in a fight, and keeping a lid on the instincts that Leo was feeding him. In a way, the elementals were unknowingly filling the position that Petra currently served for Blake's brother. A second mind that could parse through information while he focused on fighting. It proved its worth right then for Blake as he came to a single conclusion. How dare they send slaves to fight me? How dare they use such tactics? Very well then, if they send slaves to fight me, then I'll just do as I've sworn to do. And Blake shouted out in rage, temporarily giving in to the animalistic fury that Leo's mind encouraged. Then, in a flash, a flurry of blades came into existence that all glowed white with purification. They spun around him, making Blake the eye of the storm of swords as they spun, and slashed everything in the artificially enclosed space. They spun for a good few minutes before slowing down and dissolving into light. Once they were gone, they reviled the aftermath. All the hooded figures collapsed on the ground with not a single wound on their bodies. Blake had created a more powerful version of the same sword he used to free Tristan, and then made an entire cyclone of them. Now his foes were freed, and in the next moment the barrier that had been isolating them fell. It seemed that it needed the user's constant concentration in order to stay up. Now that they were asleep, the forceful releasing of their bonds being enough to knock them all out, the barrier fell all at once. It was then that Blake was greeted by the sounds of battle and bloodshed. He heard screaming of dying men, horses braying in pain before falling dead, as the knights that rode them tried to jump off so as to not be trapped under their dying bulk. Steel clashing against steel was heard everywhere in a cursed melody of death and violence. Blake bore witness to all this in the moment after his victory, and felt only rage. Rage at his enemy's betrayal. Rage at how he was made a fool of for believing in an honorable way to resolve things. Rage at the blood being spilled, all because someone couldn't handle the fact that things were changing. All this rage made Blake decide to do something he hadn't wanted to do but felt he now must. So he rose into the sky, using the wings his fused form allowed him, and poured every last ounce of his power into one move. On the ground below, the fighting men soon came to a halt. For a shadow fell over them that seemed to blanket the battlefield. That drew eyes, for it was a cloudless day at high noon. No such shadow should have existed. This naturally made them all start to look up. And there, high above all their heads, with the red-headed young king holding it aloft, was a sword. The sword was massive, easily the size of a large castle, and made of shimmering steel. It looked like the weapon of a god, one that had long grown angry at the mortals below that had gone against it. Then, without warning or hesitation, the king dropped his held-out hand, and the sword began to fall to the ground tip first. It fell maybe 200 feet before hitting the ground, yet that was still plenty of space to get the result Blake wanted. He aimed the blade to fall in the heart of the enemy forces. It soon landed, and for a moment everything went silent, the sound too loud for normal ears to register properly. A plume of dust was kicked up, and once it cleared, only decimation was left. And just like that, 70% of the enemy forces died at his hands, and nothing but a crater was left with the giant blade buried in the earth. Blake floated down, out of breath and energy both, yet staying awake and standing through sheer will. Once he touched the ground, it took everything in him to not collapse from exhaustion. He refused to fall though, and instead stayed standing and raised his right arm with a sword in hand, before shouting for the whole battlefield to hear him. Forces of the Council, go back to your homes and nations. Leave and never come back, for if you step foot in my nation again, if you try to put my people in chains once more, I shall make what happened here look like mercy as I go to your lands for an encore. Now leave and tell you leaders they are not welcome in my nation. He screamed out for all to hear his threat and declaration. The survivors of the enemy forces, which included almost all the nobles due to them being at the edges of the army, saw this and heard his words. It took them less than a second to make a decision, the correct one as well. They all began ordering a retreat and rode off for home, fear in their eyes and terror in their hearts. Blake stood still with his arm still raised for over 10 minutes, waiting till the enemy was long gone. Eventually his own forces came to him, his inner circle, and his soldiers alike staring at their king with awe as he stayed still. Then, almost as one, they kneeled. It was Richard that spoke up then from his kneeled position. All hail King Blake Brightheart, the hero king and defender of the people, he shouted out, the awe of what he just witnessed evident in his voice and forcing him to speak up. For all there understood, this was a hero. For who else could end a war with one move in order to protect the people? Who else could stand against an army to protect their freedom? Only a hero, that's who. It was in that moment though that Blake began to glow, and a voice came forth that was heard not just by Blake but by all those present. Notice, individual Blake Brightheart has fulfilled all required conditions. Hatching of the chosen hero's egg has begun. The crowning ceremony shall now begin, the words of the world spoke up for all to hear. Meanwhile, Blake finally lost his battle with his exhaustion and surrendered to the embrace of sleep with a smile on his face. He heard the voice and knew then that he'd done it. He only wondered what this meant for him going forward, but was soothed by Yami and Hikari that all would be well, and with that, he fell asleep and looked forward to waking a hero. Chapter 100, Chapter 94. Chapter by random note, see the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Petra's attention was drawn to something beyond her normal surroundings. She was working on some of the various projects her Lucian had given her, some of which he hadn't told her to work on at all but had considered once or twice. That was enough for her though, enough to make them worth dedicating time to in case it became needed. Of course, the Manas also had her own projects, such as the one she'd quietly deemed Project Moving Out to herself. Of course, she prioritized her Lucian's projects first, though, and gave them all the attention she could. Yet, despite her utter concentration on the various projects, coming up with a blueprint for the Colosseum her partner now wished constructed being the latest of such, her attention was dragged outward. Petra felt something going on through one of the soul corridors that were attached to Lucian's soul and her current home. Massive fluctuations were going on, and spikes of power were felt through it. To her it was obvious that something was going on, though she guessed that it likely went more or less unnoticed by her partner. He didn't have nearly so good an understanding of his soul as she did after all. The fact that it was Blake's connection made the situation take her full focus. So Petra sent a feeler through the connection to try to understand what was going on. Quickly after that though, it became clear that Blake was going through some sort of evolution that felt oh so familiar in some ways. It felt like what she remembered Lucian's ascent to Demon Lord felt like, yet different in many ways, and in others as if it was inverted somehow. It was strange, but she quickly put things together faster than most supercomputers in her partner's old life could. Blake is awakening. He's hatching the hero's egg, the thought hit her quickly, and she rapidly came to a decision. She remembered helping along her own partner's evolution, and saw the results for herself. With how important Blake was to Lucian, she wished to do the same. The idea of getting more data on how chosen heroes worked was also a factor she admitted to herself. But deeper inside her being, a seed of care and emotion existed for the young man. Petra had seen the boy grow from her place within Lucian, watching him come into his own. She felt the emotions her partner had for him, and that left an imprint on her own developing personality due to how strong the emotions were. With all that considered, Petra didn't hesitate to do what she did next. Though she did think to at least give her partner some basic courtesy. Notice, individual Blake Brightheart is undergoing evolution. Awakening of a true chosen hero has begun. I am leaving to aid in the process to ensure optimum results. Petra sent the message to Lucian before sending most of herself through the soul corridor, not waiting for a response. The fact that she heard her Lucian give a mental shout that sounded much like an expletive made something that she identified as a small spark of enjoyment a bonus. Blake floated in darkness that he wished in part wasn't familiar. Soon though he ceased all thoughts for the most part. Commencing super evolution from enlightened race to divine human, divine light, and darkness elemental tribrid. Evolution successful. All physical abilities have been greatly improved. The individual can now switch between material and spiritual bodies. Next, all skills and resistance already acquired by the old form will be reacquired. Successful. New intrinsic skills, ultra-speed regeneration, abyssal manipulation, and radiance manipulation have been acquired. New resistances, natural effects resistance, abnormal condition resistance, spiritual attack resistance, darkness attack nullification, light attack nullification, and spatial attack resistance have been acquired. Unique skill diligence has been deemed suitable for evolution. Commencing attempts. Notice, Manus Petra shall aid in the attempts to evolve the unique skill diligence into an ultimate skill, Petra announced after she arrived to witness the evolution. The assistance of Manus Petra is now under consideration by Words of the World. Assistance approved. With aid of Manus Petra, unique skill diligence has commenced evolution. Successful. The unique skill diligence has now evolved into the ultimate skill Jagudiel, Lord of Diligence. This completes the evolution. Notice, Manus Petra petitions Words of the World to attempt further evolution of individual Blake Brightheart's skills, Petra announced again after a pause, aiming to aid her Lucian's brother as best she can. Petition acknowledged. Searching for sufficient energy. Notice, Manus Petra is willing to provide sufficient energy, the Manus told the Words of the World. Compromise acknowledged. Proceeding the commencement of skill evolution attempts. With the aid of Manus Petra, unique skill magical arms maker has commenced evolution. Successful. The unique skill magical arms maker has now evolved into the ultimate skill Arthur, Lord of Knights. With aid of Manus Petra, unique skill heroic inspiration has commenced evolution. Successful. The unique skill heroic inspiration has now evolved into the ultimate skill Gilgamesh, Lord of Kings. This completes the evolution. Lucian sat back in his chair, processing all that had just happened. First, Petra informed him about going to aid Blake's evolution. That alone had so many implications, mainly that Blake had encountered something during the battle today that triggered the evolution. It made concern bloom in his heart, worried that something catastrophic had occurred. Then, shortly after leaving, Petra sent him a request. Requesting permission to use non-vital resources to aid in Blake Brightheart's evolution. Request granted, she'd asked, sounding far more mechanical than she usually was nowadays. He chalked up her change back into mechanical cadence to be due to the focus she had, and the sensitivity of the situation. Lucian had naturally okayed the request, and all had been quiet since. So now he waited for Petra to return and inform him as to what was going on. Luckily, it seemed that he needn't wait overly long. Evolution of Blake into a true chosen hero has been successful. In order to achieve optimal results, 70% of all stored souls have been used for energy. This includes souls once in the possession of former demon Lord Carrion. Copies of several unique skills, extra skills, and common skills were created, and their data were used to aid in achieving such results. One of the remaining embers of the hearth from the Hestia ultimate skill was also used to facilitate the evolution of Blake. Petra reported what had been used to aid Blake. Lucian sat stunned for a moment at that before asking some of the questions he had in that moment. What do you mean you used 70% of the available souls? Just how could it require that many? And how did Carrion's souls count either? He asked in shock, forgetting to keep the questions within his own mind and saying them aloud. Petra paused for a moment, seeming to consider how best to explain. The process to turn souls into the required energy became inefficient due to multiple factors. Distance, increased energy drain for the formation of ultimate skills, and needing to supply energy to increase the soul quality of Blake were all such factors, among others. And Carrion's souls that he had collected over his tenure as Demon Lord become yours by right after making him a subordinate and naming him. Was the action to use such power ill-advised? Petra explained before asking a question in a tone of voice that sounded almost fragile. Lucian took all this in before sighing and sinking into his chair. He then responded to Petra, understanding where he went wrong in his questioning. You did well, Petra. I was just surprised was all. I wasn't expecting such a drain, and the fact that this evolution came out of left field didn't help. I was just on edge, and I'm sorry for reacting that way, Petra. Can you forgive me? He told her in as gentle a voice as he could. He knew Petra was still coming into her own as a person, the process taking time to become fully realized. Emotions, social interactions, and understanding people were all things she was slowly coming to learn and develop. Changing from thinking in pure data to something more focused on the real world was something that required an adjustment period, to say the least. All this didn't detract from the fact that she was a person now, or at least becoming one. And he had just been incredibly rude to her when she definitely didn't deserve such treatment, hence his sincere apology. Petra took a moment to respond but eventually did so quietly. Of course, apology accepted, she said almost as a question, as if unsure if that was the right response in this situation. Lucian smiled, happy to see that he'd been forgiven. Glad to hear it, Petra. I never wished to make you feel bad. Especially for doing something to protect and aid someone dear to me, he told her, and got a faint approving hum from her in response. Then, just as he was starting to relax back into his chair, and aim to restart the rhythm of paperwork, his door burst open. What's wrong? Are you okay? Surtur shouted as he burst through the door, taller than his normal shortened form, and glowing with heat. Behind him was a small gaggle of people, including Lucian's spawn, Shizu, and what looked to be like a worried Carrion and Albise. It seemed that Surtur had heard him shout somehow, and rallied everyone he found on his way to his office to check on him. This also seemed to have whipped them up into a frenzy while thinking him in danger. This all would have been something Lucian might have found humorous and perhaps sweet if not for one thing. The door that Surtur blew off its hinges had slammed into his desk, and made the paperwork go everywhere. This included the inkwell he was using, staining the pages in ink. Some papers had even flown out the open window, while others that floated near the fire giant ignited and turned to ash from the heat he was emitting. This resulted in one single reaction from Lucian. God damn it, Surtur, he said in utter defeat, while wishing that Ivy would finish her first coffer harvest. Because otherwise, he might just steal Rimuru's idea and turn his new nation into a brewery, but for his personal use instead. Ramiris looked north, having felt something in the air, and soon came to recognize the feeling. It was something she hadn't felt in some time, not when she was strong enough to fully feel it at least. A hero had just been born, one with her blessing had awakened. It made a smile come to her face then, especially as she felt more how different this one was from those that had occurred in the past. Both light and dark were present in this one, and that meant only one thing. It appears that Blake has awoken. Faster than expected, but that is no surprise for the bother of that man, she murmured to herself with a small smirk on her face. She knew that he would be a great hero, one who would lead humanity as they were meant to. True heroes were the counterpart to true demon lords for a reason, and it wasn't merely due to them being their enemy. No, the demon lords were those who could lead monsters to greatness, and likewise, chosen heroes were those who could do the same for humanity. Both were meant to be the best of their respective kinds, leaders or those with the potential to be ones. The fact that Blake had been on the road to becoming a king before awakening only spelled good things as far as she was concerned. Ramiris had gotten her memories back, and as such, she could remember the times long forgotten by the world. She had been here in the cardinal world that Veldanava created and dwelled in for longer than almost anyone else. Even Guy was newer to this land than she was, having been in the demon realm for oh so long, and only arriving here some few thousand years ago. His time here began when that foolishman summoned him to defeat his enemies, and learned the hard way that a primordial was not one to be commanded easily. Regardless, Ramiris had been in this land for an incredibly long time, and had given her blessing to many humans in that time. Seldom few achieved the end goal that her blessing was meant to facilitate, and become true heroes. But even the ones that didn't awaken proved to be great in their own ways. So many nations rose to prominence and experienced a golden age under the leadership of those she granted her blessing. So many dynasties could be traced back to one such person, even in the modern day, though it appeared that the descendants of her chosen had fallen far from their ancestors' glory. It would make her sad if she actually saw anything of her chosen in them. As it was though, so many generations had passed that the current generation was nigh unrecognizable to her as being related to her chosen. They were made up of less than a percentage of her chosen after so long, and that wasn't even including the ones that claimed the name, but had none of the blood. In the end though, it seemed that Blake would be the latest in showing just what a hero can do for humanity. The fact that he was allied with a demon lord instead of pointlessly fighting them made it even more likely that the humans would experience a time of prosperity under his guidance. So she could hope at least. Let us hope that you are free of the cycle, Blake. You and your brother I feel shall bring great change I think shall be for the better. For this world has stagnated long enough, and he would be oh so bored by its now stagnant nature, she said to herself as she lounged in her dungeon. She sighed though, knowing that soon she would need to return to work. With her power back and her memories in order, her duties as queen were calling her. Her realm had been left in near lawlessness and chaos, more than was to be expected at least. She needed to go and bring her queendom to order, this was a fact. It didn't mean that Ramiris was looking forward to it though. She was just glad that the elementals hadn't been as insane as the people of this world and so many others. For elementals had never invented the accursed thing known as paperwork. A small but appreciated mercy. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.